Good morning. I have to admit that after the children's story, I feel a little underdressed this morning. And so I'm really grateful I didn't wear one of those t-shirts with a tie printed on the front of it. I was excited to see so many Unitarian Universalists, an estimated 1,500 members of our faith, ministers and lay people, descend on North Carolina for the Moral March in Raleigh just a couple of weeks ago. I was on the other side of the country myself, but in my heart I quietly cheered on those who represented our faith with their presence and their devotion. I'd like to be able to say that I wish I had been there, but that would be misleading. Even if I hadn't been keeping a long-standing commitment to work with a congregation's leadership far removed from North Carolina, I wouldn't have been there. As a Canadian, I simply didn't belong there. It would have been intrusive for me to show up. Intrusive to take sides in a fight that isn't legitimately mine, even if my heart was with the marchers. Like that curious relationship status on Facebook, for me it's complicated. As it turns out, though, social witness has often been complicated for spiritual communities, and not necessarily, not even usually, for reasons as straightforward and as obvious as mine. The first time I visited this congregation, almost 25 years ago now, I spoke with several individuals here who fondly remembered Robert Raible, who was minister here from 1942 until his retirement in 1964. At that point in time, it had already been a quarter of a century since he had retired into the backwoods of Vermont. But his memory was still fresh in the minds of many of his admirers who remained in the congregation. As folks would talk about him, two very different stories emerged. On the one hand, some individuals described him as having been a prophetic voice for liberal religion and progressive social values in the community. While on the other hand, some individuals insisted that he had been opposed to institutional social justice work on the part of congregations. It seemed difficult to distinguish between these two seemingly different portraits being painted. But both groups of individuals had loved and respected Raible, even if they hadn't always agreed with him. What was I to make of the disparity, though? Those conversations led me to spend several days over the years, weeks probably, sifting through the 42 boxes of material in the Robert Raible collection at Harvard Divinity School, seeking to better understand the inner workings of this remarkable figure of 20th century Unitarianism. A native of Louisville, Raible was raised there in a Unitarian household, making him unusual from the very beginning. His paternal grandparents had immigrated from Germany following the Civil War, while his maternal ancestors had deep roots in Kentucky and Louisiana. After a short stint in the National Guard, he entered the University of Kentucky, intending to major in agriculture. His first sense of vocation was farming, not ministry. But while working on an actual farm, as part of his studies, he contracted such a severe case of poison ivy that after having been fed through a tube, he abandoned agriculture, first for law and then for journalism. Of course, there have been some ministers over the years who, in their first real experience of church, have also certainly felt as if they had been fed through a tube when it was all over. By the time he graduated in 1921, he'd switched disciplines once again, business administration. He then worked for a Louisville bank for a couple of years while becoming increasingly active in his church during his spare time. It was on evenings and weekends that he finally discovered his natural vocation. He enrolled in Harvard Divinity School, where he won the Billings Prize for preaching in his first year. And then after completing his studies, he was ordained at the historic First Parish in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he served as assistant minister before accepting a call to a church in Peterborough, New Hampshire. From there, he went to Greenfield, Massachusetts, where he stayed 10 years before finally accepting a call to your congregation. In his earlier settlements, Raible was active in community affairs, serving as a scoutmaster and a Legion chaplain, and also serving on various boards and committees involved in local government. Indeed, he was politically active throughout most of his life, but he sought to keep that separate from the church. As summer approached in 1942, he arrived in Dallas to speak on constructive living in a destructive world. During the week that followed, he and his wife, Mildred, her name was actually Mabel, but when she married Bob Raible, she just didn't like the sound, and so she switched to her middle name. They impressed the congregation with their warmth and their charm, and by the time he pronounced the benediction at the following week's service, there was no doubt in members' minds about what their decision would be. In contrast to a failed candidacy earlier that year, in which this congregation had split right down the middle, a vote of 32 to 30. The membership voted unanimously to ask Bob Raible to accept the pulpit of this congregation. Years later, he claimed that he had accepted the call to Dallas because it was the first one that he had ever received from a Southern church. Having grown up in the South, he believed that Southern churches ought to have Southern parsons if liberal religion was to make any headway in what was then fertile but very underdeveloped territory. If his predecessor here in Dallas had been happy to return to New England, Raible was quite satisfied to leave. Less than 3 years into his Dallas ministry, he had arrived at the conclusion that he had wasted 17 years of his life in New England pulpits. Although he had loved the people and loved his parishes there, he came to feel that he had been marking time. If I had to do it all over again, he once confided, I'd take anything I could to get away from New England and even the whole eastern seaboard. Ouch. Robert Raible's question from this morning's reading, should the church confine itself to personal religion, to spiritual concerns, to counseling those in trouble, to worship and similar activities as many persons insist? Or should the church constantly be applying its gospel in political, industrial, social, and international concerns of the day? Was first asked when he was still serving the congregation in Greenfield. But it remained an active question for him throughout his ministry. He dusted off those words during his ministry here and preached them at least twice for the benefit of this congregation, while continuing to ruminate on the question itself and refine his answer as circumstances changed. For the most part, he continued to offer his neither and both response, which increasingly found expression in manners that essentially echoed the advice of William Ellery Channing, who once said, "May your life preach more loudly than your lips." In a nutshell, if Unitarians in Dallas were going to change the world, they'd better change themselves and their congregation first. Instead of simply telling the world what to do, show them your shining example instead. Let me offer a couple of illustrations. Dallas churches were still segregated when Robert Raible took up his ministry in this city. Moreover, it was not until 1944 that blacks were allowed to vote in Democratic Party primaries, having finally crushed the 1923 act of the Texas legislature that barred their participation. It was against this backdrop that two blacks attended First Unitarian Church at the invitation of church members. Several members of the congregation called the president to object to this turn of events. So the subject was placed on the agenda of the next board meeting. After inviting board members to state their opinions, the president asked the minister to offer his point of view. Raible asked the board, "Does anyone have any doubt about how I feel?" As he looked around the table at shaking heads, he concluded that there was no need to say anything more. It was obvious to him that the trustees shared his general viewpoint, although one or two were concerned that attendance might hurt the church's image in the community. When the vote was taken, not a single voice was heard in opposition to the proposal to not merely tolerate black attendance, which had been the original language, but to cordially welcome black participation at First Unitarian Church. Only one skeptical board member abstained. Once that decision had been made, the president turned to Raible and asked, "If we had voted against it, you would have resigned, wouldn't you?" Raible replied in the affirmative, while telling the board that he had wanted them to vote on the basis of their own opinions, their own changed hearts, and not out of fear that he would leave. Looking back on that day, he later observed, "I feel fortunate that this came up after I'd been in Dallas 2 years, because I feel it a mistake for a minister to try to use his influence before he has it." At the same time, he sensed that they knew me well enough to recognize that I had my own primitive ideal of personal integrity. So there was no other way in which they could have voted, and they knew it. The previous year, his sermon on Brotherhood Sunday had challenged the old cliche that good fences make good neighbors, with Robert Frost's verse, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down." Conceding that certain boundaries are natural and healthy, he challenged this congregation to help bring down the unnatural and unhealthy walls that so often separated people from one another. In his sermon, he focused on the walls based on gender, social class, and race. He expressed his disgust at a shocking commentary in the previous day's newspaper that suggested, bear with me here, pickling the ears of the Japanese or making pocketbooks out of their skin. This was wartime America. Yes, this kind of stupid utterance was rampant long before talk radio was ever invented. Raible called upon his listeners to challenge such sentiments, which made no intelligent contribution toward a better understanding between people and which were unacceptable in his mind even in times of war. He then turned his attention to the practice of separating people by race on city streetcars, viewing it as both an injustice and a common nuisance. Reminding his congregation that soldiers of different races seemed able to share with pleasure the same foxhole. He expressed the view that their parents ought to be able to share with equanimity the same streetcar seat. Believing as he did that all people were of similar value in the eyes of God, he called on his listeners to work toward full voting rights, an unbiased legal system, and economic opportunity for people of all races and classes. If significant progress could be made in these three areas, he argued, the kingdom of heaven will have been brought nearer at hand. He returned to these themes throughout his ministry, and they reflected his confidence that the world could be changed through persuasion and example. Robert Raible worked quietly but consistently toward these and other ends. He became increasingly visible in the community during his years in Dallas, rarely missing an opportunity to lead devotions at meetings of various civic organizations, to offer the invocation at school graduations, to speak on timely issues before groups like the League of Women Voters, or to appear on Elmer Scott's radio broadcast worth looking into. Such activities serve to minister to the existing members of the church, many of whom held leadership positions in the groups that Robert Raible visited. But it also attracted new people to the congregation by raising its profile in the community while promoting liberal religious values. At the same time, he ministered to the inward yearnings and nurtured the spiritual development of those who came to this church. Taken together, these approaches helped to position the church for its substantial growth that followed the post-war years. Your beloved former minister invited the members of this congregation and Unitarian Universalists across the land to strive to hold two seemingly contradictory propositions at the same time, knowing in his heart that the contradiction was more apparent than real. He argued that we could and should agree on two propositions, the first being that the social implications of our religion are indispensable to its validity and its vitality, as expressed in terms of concern for social conditions and for the struggle to create a just social order. And secondly, he argued that direct action by churches themselves is usually not advisable in the field of social or political problems, though there are exceptions, he said. One of the noteworthy exceptions was the Unitarian Fellowship for Social Justice, an auxiliary organization of which this congregation had one of the earliest chapters. He believed that they could legitimately engage in direct action without undermining respect for the diverse opinions within the congregation. Personally, I admit to many more exceptions than Robert Raible himself would have allowed. But I appreciate the wisdom about human nature and social change that's reflected in his position. Raible understood that the foundation for effective social change begins with an inward experience. Only as efforts at improvement flow from the torrential outpourings of one's religious faith, he observed, only as they are motivated by it and are measured in the relation to it as a yardstick, only thus will they have permanent and abiding value and content. If you propose to transform the world, strive to transform yourself first. Work on your own inner life before working on the inner lives of your neighbors. Strive to make your congregation a microcosm of the society you would have the world become. This was his essential gospel. And then allow the world to watch and to draw their own conclusions, to be inspired by your example. More than a century ago, Charles Eliot St. John, who was a prominent Unitarian minister and for 7 years the secretary of the American Unitarian Association, said, "The most efficient work is done inside the sacred walls, not outside." It is this very idea that Robert Raible understood so deeply, insisting that the best way to change the world for the better was to change ourselves and our religious communities first. For the most part, the world is unimpressed with our resolutions, deaf to our pronouncements, uninterested in our declarations, and at most curious about our marches. However, others do notice how we live out the values we profess. And if we can model the kind of world we desire, if we can grow in spiritual depth as individuals, if we can demonstrate our compassion as religious communities, if we can live differently and better with gladness, then what happens inside these sacred walls might be seen as relevant and desirable to the world beyond them.